Hi everyone, in this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at a game played between Viswanathan Anand and Gata Kamsky. This was played in the 1995 PCA Candidates Tournament in Las Palmas, Spain, and this is the 9th game of the Candidates. It was played between Anand and Kamsky to decide who was playing against Kasparov in the PCA World Championship. So without further ado, let's look at this game. Anand starts the game off by playing e4, and we have e5 by Kamsky. Knight f3 by Anand, knight c6, bishop to b5, and now a6. So we have the Morphy defense of the Roy Lopez. Bishop to a4, and now knight to f6, just attacking the e4 pawn. And here, Anand actually plays the move castles. He sacrifices the pawn, and if Kamsky actually captures the pawn, then just rook to e1, attacking the knight. And here you could go knight to d6, you could even go knight c5, but generally the idea is pretty similar. You just capture the pawn, or you can capture this knight on c6, and after dc6, capturing on e5 is always nice because if you look at black's position, then black's kingside is completely open, the rook is on the file, x-raying the king, and black still needs to get a couple of moves more in before he can finally castle and get his issues taken care of. So playing knight takes e4 would run into something like that. So instead, bishop to e7. Rook to e1, and now b5 is played. You can't really play a junk move like h6 because at the moment there's actually a threat of bishop takes c6, d takes c6, and knight takes e5. Previously, that really never works unless your pawn on e4 is defended. And that's because if after bishop to e7 was played, if Anand went for that exact same idea, then after dc6, knight e5, first of all, Kamsky could just capture on e4, but secondly, there's just queen d4. And, well, after knight f3, queen takes e4, rook e1, let's say, queen d5. And Kamsky has just won his pawn back, and he has really no problems of playing this position out. That's why after rook e1, the move b5 was played, because otherwise you would just lose a pawn as Kamsky. And after b5 is played, bishop to b3 by Anand, and now d6 by Kamsky. Kamsky obviously now has to defend the e5 pawn, and now he's actually threatening the move knight a5, which he wasn't the move before because the threat was actually just to play knight takes e5. So d6, c3, preparing the move d4, and that would just be a very nice central break that Anand would like to get in. And here Kamsky decides to castle. And after he castles, the move h3 by Anand. Just preventing ideas of playing the move bishop g4 or knight g4. d4 was also another option, which would have just went for the central break right away. But Anand, a bit cautious, doesn't want to allow something like bishop g4 and putting pressure on the knight. So he just plays the move h3. And here we have rook to e8 by Kamsky. And Kamsky is just simply developing his rook. Maybe later on, this bishop could be used along this diagonal. You could always bring this along the h8, a1 diagonal, and the bishop would be nicely placed in a scenario like that. So that's why the move d4 was played, and just striking in the center is the best thing to do. Bishop to b7, Kamsky hopes to develop his bishop this way, although it's not really certain what the bishop is doing because it's at the moment just staring at the e4 pawn, which isn't really doing much. Knight b to d2 by Anand, and now bishop to f8 by Kamsky. And here, Kamsky is just trying to transfer his bishop over, like I said. And here, a4 by Anand. h6 was played, just ignoring the pawn. Bishop c2 by Anand, trying to maybe defend the e4 pawn in case e takes d4 is ever played, and the rook on e8 ever puts pressure towards e4. So we have e takes d4, c takes d4, and knight to b4 by Kamsky. And Kamsky now puts pressure on the c2 bishop, and obviously he's threatening to win the bishop pair, so Anand hides his bishop by playing bishop to b1. Queen to d7 by Kamsky, and now b3 by Anand. And Anand, not only with this b3 move, is trying to defend the a4 pawn, but he's also hoping to somehow activate this bishop on c1. At the moment, you really should not activate the bishop by moving this knight, because there's threats towards this e4 pawn. So Anand hopes to activate the bishop the other way. And by fianchettoing it and using it along this diagonal, he's countering Kamsky's bishop, which we'll later on see gets to g7, and it does have a very massive effect on the remainder of the game. So g6 by Kamsky, and bishop to b2 by Anand. So Anand fianchettos his bishop, and so does Kamsky. Queen c1. Anand just protects his bishop in case there's ever pressure towards it later on in the game. So rook a to c8. And after rook a c8 was played, Kamsky is obviously trying to play moves like c5 and open the position up somehow. So Anand here plays bishop c3, but c5 by Kamsky nonetheless. He's not only threatening c takes d4 in this case, but he's also threatening an idea like if ever bishop b4, then just c takes b4, and, well, he could always get his rook into the very nice c3 square. The rook would be doing quite a lot, and with the transfer of the other rook to c file, Kamsky's pieces would just be completely occupying that file, and it's really hard to kick those rooks away. So the move d5 was played with intentions of trying to, first of all, not allow c takes d4, but also to hopefully activate that bishop, because the bishop shouldn't just be staring at its pawn when it's fianchettoed. So queen to e7 was played, and after this move was played, Anand just decides to bring the knight back to f1. A move like a takes b5, rook a7 should definitely have crossed Anand's mind, because you're obviously trying to play with the very active rook along the 7th rank, and maybe after rook a8, queen a3, the position would definitely be good, but the problem for Anand is that Kamsky just can play the waiting game and wait to see what Anand will do. And really, Anand has nothing with his rook along the a file. Knight f1 was played instead of capturing on b5. Knight to h7, and now we have a trade of bishops. You don't really have to trade the bishops right away. You could maybe activate the knight first, but Anand decides to trade the bishops because it does weaken Kamsky's kingside after all. So knight to e3 was played here. Another move to consider is definitely knight to g3, which basically has the same purpose, trying to get around the weak squares in Kamsky's position. But an idea that Kamsky could have is just play knight f8, queen d2, for instance, and now knight d7. Simply trying to get the knight into the e5 square, maybe bring the king to h7, and then maybe try to use these pieces effectively. Maybe an idea later on could be f5. Not at the moment, but later on in the game. And you can see that Kamsky can start finding ways to actually break through the position, which seems to be really in Anand's favor. Knight g3 is an option that you could also choose if you don't want to play knight e3, but knight e3 was played, and after h5, now queen to d2 by Anand. And with queen to d2, Anand is trying to maybe develop the queen and use this rook efficiently on the c file. King to g8 by Kamsky, and now a takes b5, and knight to d1. And Anand wasn't really trying to use his knight to go to f5, but he was really trying to use it to get to the queen side. And here, knight to a6 was played, and knight c3 now by Anand. Kamsky goes b4, and now knight to b5 by Anand. And what Anand is trying to do is pretty simple. He's trying to use the weaknesses that Kamsky has created from earlier in the game, and he's using it to his advantage. For instance, this very weak d6 pawn, which is first of all a backward pawn, but it's also just an easy target. Queen f4, for instance, to target this pawn, is something that Anand should consider. So knight c7, and Kamsky tries to trade the knights off, but bishop to d3. Anand is just going to defend the knight, so knight takes b5, bishop takes b5, and now rook e to d8. And here bishop to c4 was played by Anand. If you think about playing the move rook to a7, with threats of bishop to c6, which would later on threaten rook takes b7, etc., then just rook to a8 by Kamsky. And Kamsky is completely fine if you ever capture the bishop on b7, because, well, after queen takes b7, just after bishop c6, just queen c7, Kamsky is completely fine, because after bishop a8, rook a8, nothing really happened, and Kamsky can just play the position as if this simplification wasn't really employed. Another thing is that after rook to a8, if you ever want to double the rooks with rook e to a1, then just queen takes e4. Kamsky can just capture that pawn on e4, and he's completely fine. You can't capture the bishop because there's rook takes a1 check, and you just lost the pawn as Anand, and now it's very hard to say whether your position is in shape. So that is why bishop c4 instead, just reinforcing the d5 pawn. And Anand will get to that bishop a bit later. So we have the move knight to f6, and now queen to h6. Anand tries to utilize the very weak position of Kamsky's king. At the moment, there are threats like e5 trying to break through that way. And unfortunately, you cannot go knight takes e4 here as Kamsky, because if you play knight takes e4, then there is this actually very nice move of rook takes e4. And it's already lost for Kamsky, because if Kamsky captures on e4, then there's knight g5. And he has no way of stopping checkmating threats. For instance, if he goes queen to f5, then just rook to e1. And Anand controls the f-file completely, and if now you try the move queen to f6, then there's actually a very nice tactic that Anand can play, and I encourage you to pause the video and find out what this is. Okay, so Anand can actually play the very astonishing move, rook to e7. And this is actually a very cool move because, well, you cannot capture this rook because after queen takes e7, there's queen h7 check. The king must go to f8, and now just queen to h8 is checkmate. But at the same time, what do you exactly do? Because there's a threat of queen h7 check, followed by rook takes f7 check. And also, at the same time, there's a threat of rook takes b7. So queen g7 could be played, but now after queen takes g7 check, king takes g7, well, you can just play the move knight e6 check here, and you're already way better. So he goes queen to f8 and tries to trade the queens off, but Anand is not willing to do that. Queen g7, and now rook to a7. Right now, if Anand played a move like king to h1, for instance, then Kamsky could get ideas of knight takes e4, because here, if you capture the knight, then just queen takes a1 check. But it's really no big deal because that's not what happened. Rook to a7 instead, making sure the rook is not in the line of fire of that queen. And after rook to a7, you could defend with rook to b8, but at the same time, rook c7 is also another option. And this is what Kamsky goes for. And here, Anand plays bishop to a6, and he's going to win the exchange, if bishop takes a6 is played. So rook to b8, Kamsky tries to defend, and now e5. And this e5 move is just a simple pawn break, which just tries to get the position in Anand's favor. And after e5 is played, knight to e8 by Kamsky, trying to defend the d6 pawn. It's not a good idea to really capture on e5 when ideas like d6 are possible, and now after rook d7, just knight takes e5. This is basically a lost game for Kamsky. So knight e8. Rook takes b7, and Anand trades the rook and bishop. Queen d8, queen f8, and now rook to a1. And here I was actually interested by why Anand didn't exactly play the move e6. And e6 is a move that many people would probably want to play, especially in a position where black is completely restricted, and it doesn't seem like Kamsky has much. Because, well, if you ignore the pawn by playing something like f5 or f6, it's really the same effect, then just e7. If you defend the knight with queen to f7, then just knight g5. And, well, what do you do here? There's a threat towards the queen. There's also a threat towards this knight if you ever move the queen away. So what does Kamsky exactly have? Nothing. So after e6, if you capture the pawn, then there's just rook takes e6. And obviously, if you don't do anything to defend the knight, then just you lose the knight. So knight g7, queen takes f8, king takes f8, and now rook takes d6. And this seems completely fine until you see the move that Kamsky can now play. Kamsky can go c4, and after this move is played, you see a completely different perspective about the game. At first, you might say that Anand was completely winning. Well, now you might say that Kamsky still has chances, because he can create a passed pawn, and he's basically restricting Anand's knight from ever trying to get involved into the attack, because now Anand's knight must just simply guard the b1 square where the pawn is trying to get to. And after rook b4, rook c6, and now knight f5, now we could even say that Kamsky is better, because Anand doesn't really have a clear plan of how to continue. So rook a1 instead, but after knight c7, just queen to d7. And here, d takes e5 is not going to be played because there's d6, and here there is queen to e8, which defends the knight because now you must capture the queen if you don't want to lose your own queen. So queen takes d8, knight takes e8, and rook to a8 though. And after rook to a8, this is the point where things really start to turn for Anand, because you must defend the knight, otherwise you're just going to be down material, but now knight takes e5. The simple threat is d7, but there's really no way to stop it, so Anand is already winning. So that is why queen to d7, after this is played, queen to b8 was played by Kamsky. And here, Anand simply just captures the pawn on d6, and this is basically already winning for Anand. c4, Kamsky tries to create the complications, but after b3, rook b1, b2, queen c5, rook to b3, here queen to d4 was played by Anand. Queen to b4, knight to g5, putting pressure on the f7 pawn, rook c3, and now queen to f4. At the moment, there's a threat of queen takes f7 check, which would just completely win. So f6 was played by Kamsky. And here, Kamsky is trying to perhaps let Anand capture with the queen, and then there could be problems after rook c1 check, and maybe Kamsky can get something out of it. But Anand just captures with the pawn, and here Kamsky thinks he has something after knight takes d5. But I encourage you to pause the video one last time and find out how Anand just simply wins here. Okay, so Anand just plays the move f7 check, and after this, it's already lost for Kamsky. Because if you go king to g7, then there's just f8 queen check. You must play queen takes f8, it's the only legal move, and now knight to e6 check. King to h7 is really the best, because if you go king to g8 or king to h8, you just immediately get checkmated. So king to h7, but now after the simple knight takes f8 check, this is already winning for Anand, hands down about that, and Kamsky has nothing. So that's why after the move f7 check was played, Kamsky resigned the game, and a very brilliant victory for Viswanathan Anand. So I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comment section, and stay tuned for more chess.